Today, I am so excited to welcome Katherine Noyes from Lotus Speech and Wellness to Hope Survives podcast. Thank you so much for coming on today, Katherine.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm so happy to be here.
So, can you share a little bit about yourself with our audience?
Yeah, so I'm Katherine. I am a speech language pathologist, or SLP. I'm also a certified brain injury specialist, and I am a yoga teacher. So I've been practicing as a speech language pathologist for over 11 years now, primarily focusing in the medical setting, working with folks with brain injury and other neurological impairments. And I just started my private practice, Lotus Speech and Wellness, within the past year. And with my private practice, the mission is to help people improve communication, cognition, and mind-body wellness after a brain injury or other neurological impairment. And we do that through our speech language pathology services, yoga and mindfulness offerings. And even though I'm a speech language pathology practice, I really try to consider communication and cognition in a really holistic sense and all the other factors that might impact that as well.
Thanks so much for sharing. So, what got you interested in brain injury recovery?
So as an undergrad, I studied neuroscience and Spanish, so two seemingly unrelated areas, but I quickly became interested in the overlap and the neuroscience of language. And so when I decided to go to graduate school to become a speech and language pathologist, I was really interested in helping people who are recovering their communication skills after a brain injury. And then I've really fallen in love with this work. My clinical passion is in working with people with brain injury where they have these clear functional goals, whether it's professional, academic, social, where they're noticing things that are different now than they were before, and they're wanting to make progress. And I can really meet them where they are, figure out together as a team, how can we help you more actively participate in your daily activities, communicate more effectively. Yeah, that's why I enjoy it. And I know your podcast is all about hope. I mean, one of the reasons I love working with people with brain injury is seeing the progress that happens too. And it's, really tangible, like getting back to work full time or having a more fulfilling relationship, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing. I was so excited to invite you to come on the podcast because we originally connected on Instagram and I was seeing some of the things you were sharing. I thought this would be such great information to dive deeper in for our audience because I don't think we've done an episode yet on communication and cognition and the relationship between them. And one of the things that I find as a survivor when it comes to communication and cognition is that over the years, I found that affects not only the way that I can work or do those things, but it affects my relationships and it affects the way that I interact with the world. And it affects the way that the world interacts with me. Because if I can't communicate what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, sometimes I don't even know what I'm thinking and feeling right. And if I'm not able to process quickly enough or things like that, I find that it's really easy to get discouraged, to feel overlooked, to feel mistreated, and it can be really overwhelming. And so I am so grateful that you're coming on the podcast because as a survivor and so many years of living with brain injury, my goal is to get information out to people as much as possible and share, what are things you can do to help at home or how does this actually work? Like, it's very empowering to understand how and why the things are happening to your brain. So let's just get started. The first question I kind of had is, how are cognition and communication connected? So where do you want to begin?
Yeah. So, as you were talking, I was thinking about how, often people think of speech language pathologists that all we do is help people speak more clearly. And in fact, often people think of speech language pathologists and they think of the person in the school system. They don't even think of brain injury in speech and language pathologies. So I think that's the first thing, is that we do have a broad field. Yes, we have people who specialize in the education setting and helping children, but then we have those of us who specialize in what we call like the medical side of our field, helping people with communication and cognition. So we're speech and language pathologists. Some people use speech and language interchangeably, but the way we think about that is speech is how your speech sounds come out. Often voice is tied in with that. And then language is the ideas that you have, whether it's thinking of the word, organizing your thoughts. We also, within the communication side, that would include reading, writing. And then the cognition side, it's like they both affect each other. So cognition includes things like attention, memory, executive function, which would be organizing, planning, problem solving, sequencing, self-monitoring, and all of those skills, kind of like you're saying, with the speed affecting communication, memory. Like if I can't remember what I did yesterday and someone asks me what I did, it's going to be hard for me to communicate about it. If I'm having trouble focusing, maybe I'm more easily distracted. That's going to impact my ability to talk about that as well. So communication and cognition are actually really closely connected. I think it's false to try to put like communication in one little silo and cognition in another silo. And, I was saying to you too earlier, like with your podcast, you talk about all these other things too in life: sleep, dysautonomia, the gut. Like those things also impact our communication. If I'm exhausted, I'm not going to be as effective at communicating, whether it's because I just cannot focus or I can't think of my words. So it's all, again, that's why I think it is important to take this holistic view, this holistic perspective. Is they're so interconnected. In communication, we're doing it almost all the time, right? Like we're talking with family and friends, we're at school, we're at work, we're reading, we're writing. So when you think about it, in our social world that we live in, communication is so essential.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And it really is the foundation of our world, being able to communicate. But after a brain injury, how are some ways that you've seen communication be affected?
Mm-hmm. So I think often folks are referred by their healthcare provider to see a speech and language pathologist for one of the more like stereotypical speech and language symptoms that are coming up, whether it's word finding. And that's one of the most common things, I would say. So people feel like they know what they want to say and they can't think of the right way they want to say it, or they start to say something and then they lose their train of thought, or even it's just, people often describe it as like a wall going up. And so that's definitely something that we're seeing a lot. But then again, as you sort of insinuated, like you peel back the layers and there's that cognitive piece as well. So I often, for people who have had a brain injury, I'm often starting with attention when I work with people, because attention is a foundational skill that we need. We have to be paying attention to remember something new. We have to be paying attention if we want to be talking about something. So often I will start with looking at attention and noticing if that person has anything distracting them. And we talk about internal distractions, so things within yourself that would include like fatigue, anxiety, thinking about things you have to do. And then external are things outside you, like the bird that just flew by my window and is distracting me, or noises that are happening outside the room. And so, and again, this is where it becomes holistic too, because it's not really in the speech language pathology scope of practice per se to be the one to address dysautonomia. But if someone is constantly in fight, flight, or freeze, are they going to be able to learn and apply finding strategies in that moment? Probably not. And I think that's where how I was part of how I became interested in this overlap with like how yoga and mindfulness can help too.
That's amazing. Yeah. And in last week's episode, we talked about how like different pillars of concussion care and how, you know, I interviewed Melissa Biscardi and she talked about how like you need to really start with the autonomic system and nutrition and the psychological difficulties before you can even get to the memory and cognition, where I found that in my care, it was often the opposite. When I first had my TBI, now this was 2007, so I didn't get into proper, I say proper, it wasn't even really proper, but I didn't get into like any rehab until 2008. And then they were just doing memory games and they were trying to do that, but nobody addressed my balance. And so then I kept falling and hitting my head again. And I felt like everything was just all these different pieces of my recovery. None of them fit together. And it was confusing. And I suffered with vestibular and dysautonomia for over 10 years before diagnosis with that. Mm-hmm. And so even though I was going to doctors all the time, so that's why I'm really passionate about this podcast and sharing information. And so what have you seen when it comes to like working with brain injury patients as far as, you know, do you have any examples or things you can share on how it's affected patients' lives? Of course, keeping patient privacy, but
how participating in speech therapy.
Yeah. Or life? How like you've seen the different aspects of the different sides of recovery kind of come together for anyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, take someone who was working before they had their brain injury and then they experienced a traumatic brain injury and they've gone through perhaps a hospital stay and now they want to get back to work. And so, I mean, work is so critical and so for so many reasons, financial and just personal fulfillment and all those reasons. So trying to get them back to work. And I think the speech language pathology field is starting to shift a little bit more in a direction that I like, where I think for a while we had a little bit of a bad rap of like, oh, is cognitive rehab just like memory exercises where someone's going to read me a list of words and I have to say them back, you know, forwards and then backwards and then alphabetized. There's a real movement and there's some amazing SLPs out there. And I love to consider myself among them, where we take everything's very person-centered. So if you are having trouble with memory and you're trying to get back to work, in our initial meeting, we're talking about what are some of the demands that you have at work that require memory, that require word finding. And then we are coming up with strategies to support you at work. And I think we use the word functional. Therapy is very functional. So yeah, I mean, again, without like giving any specific examples, I just think we're really working on the skills that you will then use at work. And then, you know, that's just the work example. It could be school. It could be, again, family, and depending on severity of brain injury, it's different goals that we're targeting. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And what are some ways that you've seen the different aspects of the speech therapy or the cognition or the communication? What are some ways that you've seen people's lives improve?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think people feel more confident as communicators. I think people, again, when we take this from a holistic standpoint, they are also connected perhaps with other resources that help them in other areas. I mean, take the example of looking at attention. And if I'm really fatigued, that's going to affect attention, which then affects communication. So people, I think, either we directly talk about self-advocacy or people start advocating and trying to get their needs met in other ways. I think, you know, bottom line, it's helping people reach their goals, whether it's getting back to doing what they were doing before their injury, or they have new goals for themselves and they're trying to achieve. So it's very individualized. It's very much person to person. What are your specific goals and how can I support you with reaching them?
Yeah, that's great. And so, even though it's individualized, are there some things that you might be able to offer as advice for our listeners, whether we have a mom listening that has a kid that has a brain injury or a survivor themselves that's trying to get better? They turned on this episode to learn about communication and cognition. And so, what are some tools that you could give them that maybe they could do just right where they are at home?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I would say seek out a speech and language pathologist in your area. Again, our scope is very broad, so trying to find one who specializes in brain injury would be great. They will be able to help you in your individual situation. I think what we started talking about too with your nervous system and being in a good place to be able to learn strategies and use them, I think yoga and mindfulness is why I incorporate that into my practice. By activating that parasympathetic nervous system, calming your mind, you're then more able to use those strategies. One thing we talk about with folks who are getting frustrated about like not being able to say things the way they'd like is, I think, take a step back and think about what's the goal of communication. It's to get your idea across. So try not to beat yourself up if you have a word on the tip of your tongue and you just can't get that word. Remember, the goal of communication is to express yourself, to socialize, and think of another way to say it maybe. And that pause in your mind might feel like an eternity, but in reality, it might just be a second or two. So that's something that we remind people. And then there's a communication example as far as cognition. I would say like memory is something I see people coming with difficulty with remembering new things. And one thing that we often recommend is using external strategies to help. So if you have a notepad, if you have your iPhone, if you have like a piece of paper, write down key things that you want to remember. You can repeat that, read it over to help encode that in your brain. Writing things down also helps make sure you were paying attention in the first place. So yeah, I could go on, but there's just a couple ideas of some strategies that can help.
That's great. Thank you so much. You said you could go on and on. Are there some others? Because if you have other ideas.
Yeah, well, so I gave one communication, one cognitive. I mean, I think executive functioning, again, that's a really broad area, but that's the problem solving, the planning. Often, I think people's goals for themselves are really big, which is great. But if we can break them down into more manageable parts, that's really helpful. So I know some people will have a task for themselves, which is like clean the house, let's say. And that's a really big task. And it might even be so big that you don't even know how to get started. And in fact, will avoid doing it. And I mean, that could happen to anyone, any of us, brain injury or not. And so what we often do is we work a lot on planning strategies, prioritizing. So thinking about what's most important to you, what's more urgent. And then we break tasks down into more manageable parts. And maybe instead of cleaning the house, it's cleaning the office. And in fact, instead of cleaning the office, it's just tidying up, the desk. And how long do I think that might take? And then when that's done, what's another project there? And you can see how those executive function strategies can help at home. They can help with work. They can help with school. So that's another example.
Yeah, that's a great one because I can relate to that overwhelming. I mean, I think everyone, even if you don't have a brain injury, can get overwhelmed by a big task. But the difference when you have a brain injury is you don't know how to break it down, and you maybe don't process it in a way that makes sense to you, and you just kind of freeze. And you just, I mean, at least for me, I don't want to generalize for everyone, but I think breaking things down into smaller bits, you might need some help doing that. And I know that I would often have to have my mom help me break things down because I wasn't always able to make those decisions myself on if I wouldn't need to organize my room, and I look around and I'm just like, okay, well, I have to organize my closet and I have to organize my desk and I have other things. Like somebody without a brain injury might go, okay, I'll just do my desk first and then I'll do my closet. But with a brain injury, you're like, I have no idea what to do, so I just do nothing. And I'm also tired. And so you kind of just kind of break down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one thing we find is using templates can help. So we'll often train like prioritization templates you can use, and you can actually, get your pen out and just, brain dump. What are some of the things that I have coming up that I want to do? Which ones are actually the most important? Which ones can I maybe delegate? Which ones can I put on my schedule for next week? So, it's strategies, there's systems, things to make life more manageable. And again, planning, that's not just a cognitive skill, that's a communication skill too, because maybe you need to tell someone what your plan is. Maybe you're probably doing some reading and writing as you're doing your planning and problem solving. And you're right, decision making can be harder, that processing can be slower. We often recommend to folks to start to notice how long things take so that you can estimate time frames. So, if I'm cleaning my office, maybe I'm timing or I might guess, I think this is going to take me half an hour. And then after I am done, I look and see how long it actually took, because then that can inform me for later, the next time I'm trying to, fit different activities into my day. And we talk a lot about routine too, but I'll have a better sense of what could I fit in that half-hour slot as well, because I'll get better at breaking my tasks down, knowing about how long they might take.
Yeah, that's good. Can you go a little bit more into routine?
Yes, I'm a big fan of routine. Some people hear routine and are like, it's so rigid, I don't want to be constricted by it. But I talk about routine as something that you put into place to help you be more proactive and intentional with your time. It takes a load off your attention because you're not having to use your energy to think, what should I do next? What are the things that I had happening later today? You kind of know this plan. It helps memory, because when you get into a routine, first I'm doing this, then I'm doing this, then I'm doing that. And often I'll start with talking to people about just like, what's the morning routine? So we don't have to do a routine for the whole day, but what do you do when you first get up? How do you start your day? Or it's an evening routine, perhaps. What are the few steps that you're doing to get ready to fall asleep? And, routine is something that should work with you, not against you. So if you had planned that you were supposed to go for a walk at 1:00, and then at 12:55, your best friend shows up and you would absolutely love to reconnect with them. Like, you don't need to say, I'm so sorry, but in 5 minutes, according to my routine, I need to go for my walk. No, that's not it. But it's supposed to add some structure into your day, help you feel like you have more control over what to expect, how you're going to pace yourself cognitively as well during the day. Yeah, I think routine is great, and starting small again. Like, if you don't have any routines, notice maybe you already have a morning routine, you don't even realize it, or notice if you have some routines during the week, like is Thursday laundry day? So there's lots of different ways to look at it.
How would you help somebody to get back on a routine when they get off of their routine? Because that is one of the big challenges, I think, that not only myself, but others with brain injuries will find. If you have a bad day, let's say, I hesitate to use the word bad, but you have a difficult day with a lot of a headache, or you feel really off, or you're just fatigued, or you're recovering from doing too many activities. How do you get back on the routine after that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, that's one reason that I like to incorporate this like reflection period, whether it's just one task or a day. Like, if you're feeling really tired, maybe can you look back at what you did that day or the day before, and maybe see if there is something in your routine that you might need to tweak. Um, there's this way of thinking about cognitive reserve. Some people say it's like blocks in a box, or I've heard spoons, just knowing that you have so much to work with in a day. And so if you know you're having a dinner party at the end of the day, you might need to shift some things around earlier so that you have the energy to enjoy yourself during that party. And then also the next day, not feel totally exhausted. So I think, again, with this idea that you want routine to work with you, if you wake up and you're exhausted and you're falling off your routine, like that's not the end of the world. I think it can help to, first of all, like give yourself some grace, and maybe you start back up with just doing the morning routine. Again, let's take it a little bit smaller. It can be flexible. It doesn't have to be in stone, and things change. So I hear what you're saying. It is frustrating. Like you feel like, it's a routine. I'm tied to it and I have to do it every day. But I think use it as a support versus something that's restricting you. Does that make sense?
That's a great way to look at it. I like that, the support as opposed to the restriction. Yeah, that's good. That's good. One of the things I really love about this conversation and what you've shared when you were talking about communication was, especially with word finding, I've been kind of thinking about it as you've been sharing, but you said that if you're having word finding issues, so many survivors get so hung up on figuring out that particular word and get so frustrated that they can't find it. And you said, well, the point of communication isn't to say that word, but it's to get your idea across. And so I know we're backtracking a little bit, but can you go a little bit deeper into that idea of maybe more flexible with the communication, and how can a survivor that feels frustrated with how they might feel like they are not able to communicate the way that they want to, and maybe they just tend to not say anything because of that, but what's some encouragement you can give someone on how to grow in their communication skills?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's easier for me to say than I think a lot of people who I've worked with really do want to say it the way they want to say it. And it is so frustrating. So one thing that I say is that frustration to some extent is a good thing, because it shows you have the awareness that you are having a little trouble with this skill, that it's something to work on, and that you can find another way to get your idea across. People who have no awareness and no frustration, it's going to take a little bit longer for them to get where they want to be. So a little frustration is normal. Okay. I certainly don't want to downplay it. I think a lot of people who've had a brain injury get told, oh, well, everyone sometimes has trouble thinking of the words. And this is different, right? After a brain injury, this is happening more often. It's tied into these other difficulties that you're having. So again, my recommendation of just remembering ultimately this goal of communication is to share your ideas, to connect with people, whether it's just purely like a social capacity relationship or professional, academic, and getting that idea across, whether it's using slightly different words, a different way of saying it, whether you find yourself gesturing a little bit more. Sometimes people feel like it becomes a little bit of charades, or I've seen people where they're drawing, writing things, because that is an easier way for their brain to express themselves. I mean, I think I haven't mentioned this yet, but communication is more than just what we say. Communication is the verbal side, but there's also the nonverbal side, how we say what we're saying. I think there's a piece of this too, where educating family and communication partners comes into play a lot too, because folks often find that their communication partners have their best interests in mind, and they think it's helpful to fill in the blanks for them. And so they know what their partner is trying to say. And so to almost like spare them that moment of trying to think of the word, they just will say it for them. And my experience is more often that people are like, just like, give me an extra second to think of my idea so I can be the one to say it. So there's an element of training communication partners that I do, and that other SLPs do, just to know that that person might just need a little extra time to express their idea. So I think thinking of communication, it's usually not just one person by themselves. There's a partner or partners, and there's the environment that they're in as well. So how can we just maximize the whole situation for them?
Yeah, that's great. You were reading my mind, because my next question was going to have to do with family members or caregivers or people around the person who's struggling. And so you already mentioned that maybe filling in the blanks for them isn't always the best thing to do. But what are some questions that maybe they could ask to try and help? Because I know for me, like my mom she was pretty good at asking me questions about, like, when I was struggling, she would say, okay, well, she would ask me something else about what I was trying to say, or she would like jog my memory by asking different types of questions to help me think about and express what I wanted to say. And so, do you have any examples of that, or what are some tips that you would have for a family member that's listening to this today?
Yeah, that's a great question again. So I think if the person is really struggling to think of a word, and you know the word they're trying to think of, instead of saying it for them, you can give them essentially like a little hint. So if I'm trying to think of I'm holding up a pen. So I'm trying to think of this word. Instead of me saying, oh, it's a pen, you say, it starts with the sound p. It's a pe. So you're maybe giving them the sound and see if that reminds them. Or maybe I start to lead in with what the word is. I write with and then maybe the person just says, a pen. They just needed that little lead in. Another thing that can be helpful as a communication partner, if you're starting to have a little bit of breakdown in the conversation, you can say back what you're hearing your partner say to you. So, and again, maybe it's because the person has lost their train of thought, or they have this moment where they've frozen and they can't think of the word. As the partner, I could say like, okay, so I think what you were saying was such and such, or so yeah, you were just saying this, or what I heard you say was this. And just like a gentle prompt to that often will bring the person right back. But also I think just being understanding and knowing that this is a normal thing that can happen, and there are good days and there are bad days, and offering some grace to that person and some space just for them to be able to think about it and maybe say things a little bit differently, and knowing that, again, that's okay.
Thank you for sharing that. Communication is just one of those difficult things, because you mentioned just now, it's not just verbal, it's nonverbal as well. And so something that I found is a big struggle, I might be able to talk and express myself, but it took me many years to learn how to pick up social cues, to understand sarcasm, to understand jokes, to understand, read between the lines, so to say. I would just tend to take everything everybody said at face value. And I've shared this story before. I don't know if I've shared it on the podcast, but this was maybe 2 years after my brain injury. I was a teenager, and it was a girl that was one of my friends in high school. And she was like, does this example, like, does this shirt make my butt look big? And I just said, well, maybe you want to try some different pants. And I thought she was like, I thought she wanted help. Like, I thought she wanted advice, but what she really was asked, she wanted me to say was, no, you look great. Right. You look fine. I thought she looked fine, but it was like something where I couldn't understand why she got so mad at me when she was like asking me for my opinion. And I was trying to be nice. And I was like, I was giving her outfit suggestions, which that's what teenage girls do. Right. And so I remember like she was like so upset, and I told my mom about it, and my mom was like, well, she wasn't actually asking that. She just wanted you to say, no, you look great. And then I said to my mom, you wanted me to lie? And my mom was like, no. But it was like, I could not grasp the concept of social norms. And, I really couldn't read between the lines. And so do you have any like tips or any any things or any thoughts on the side of social norms and social cues and the nonverbal stuff?
Yeah. So I think that's another area that people don't often think of, that a speech and language pathologist could help them. But we certainly are a resource if you're noticing that you're not picking up on those things, especially they all happen so fast. I mean, both verbal and nonverbal cues are usually fleeting, right? Like you're getting a little face or a look, or you get a comment. And so I think, that's one of the things that's hardest about social communication, is just how quickly it all happens. And you don't realize it until until someone's having trouble with it. Yeah, it's tricky. I think what you did, which is processing it with someone, if you weren't sure what had gone wrong. So asking someone you trust to kind of check in with you about that. Again, you didn't have an SLP at the time, they would have been a good resource. I think just being aware that communication is both verbal and nonverbal. Some of the more like indirect language and sarcasm, the abstract language, it can be more difficult after a brain injury. So I know I've had some success with clients, even like starting to watch some of their favorite shows again and talk about them with family. Like if their whole family's laughing about something that's happening in Schitt's Creek and they aren't getting it, they can talk about that social interaction that happened and learned a little bit from that. But I would say that's a great example of where an SLP can be a good resource. And it's going to take maybe some practice to get back to, again, being able to do it right on the spot.
Mm-hmm. It can take time, practice,
Yes.
and yeah, I like your idea of like TV shows or things like that, because it does help you, because it gives you some context. I think reading fiction as well.
Mm-hmm.
I got a Kindle a Kindle Paperwhite that you can make the font really a lot bigger. And I find that, I don't know if you've heard of the Open Dyslexic font, but it's for people with dyslexia. But I find it's way easier for me to read with my eyes, and my eye movements, like, weren't always working together. They're better now from different therapies, but sometimes I would find my eyes would just like not be able to focus. And so the dyslexia font made a huge difference. So like I have my Bible app. I use the Logos Bible app, but I have my Bible app in the dyslexia font. I have my Kindle in the dyslexia font. And even though I don't have dyslexia, because the way that the font is weighted, it's easier on your eyes and it's easier to process. And so that was a really big game changer for me when it came to reading. And so like the first thing I did when I got my Kindle was I read the entire Chronicles of Narnia series. And I hadn't read it since I was a kid, like all 7 books. And there was like a deal on Amazon. You can get the whole collection on an e-reader, and I just really enjoyed reading, and I started to enjoy reading again. Reading before was such a task for me, and it really helped to open my world and open my eyes. And I think reading has helped me to understand social things as well.
That's such a great tip. I love that. Yeah. And I was thinking some of the support groups like you run and offer, I think learning from other people in the community, like, here's a situation I was in, like, has anyone experienced something similar? What examples do you have? I think that is such a great resource that I would encourage people to take advantage of, because there's this great community. And I think the pandemic, with so many things being virtual, it's even more accessible now, and bounce it off other people who've been through it as well. I bet that, with that situation, you'd have some laughs as well, sharing some of those stories, right? But I love the idea with reading.
Yeah, thank you. And that's why I do the Zoom groups too. So we do have a Zoom group once a month for Hope After Head Injury. And so, yeah, it can be really helpful, and not to be afraid to share, even if you maybe are struggling with your words. It's okay, like, to speak up. I know we've had people in the Zoom groups that they start speaking and they immediately apologize for the way that they speak. And I'm always like, no, it's okay. Like, you're in the right place. Take as much time as you need. You don't have to try and rush through what you're saying.
Yeah.
But it can be emotional because it affects your self-worth. It affects how you view yourself.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's so much tied in with how we communicate and how people perceive us. And that's why even these subtle changes, they really can have a big impact and they can mean a lot to that person.
Yeah. And sometimes you only learn things by doing too, and unfortunately by making mistakes, but sometimes that's how you learn. Like, I didn't learn about sarcasm and jokes until like it was maybe 100 times that I realized I wasn't getting it. And I started to understand, oh, when they say it in that tone, they're being sarcastic. But I would have people, going through school, because I had my brain injury at 14. So going through and people being like, what's wrong with you? Like, they would look at me, they'd be like, they think I was stupid or dumb that I didn't understand their sarcasm or their jokes. And it can get a little disheartening and it affects how you view yourself. So I do think talking to other survivors and certain things like the dyslexia font, I only learned that by trying it. And it was actually, I didn't mention this earlier, my sister has dyslexia. So my mom found the font for my sister. And when they started to put it on the Kindle and stuff, and I was like, why don't I try this? And it really helped. So, finding things that help and learning from other survivors can help us to know that we're not alone.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Katherine, thank you so much for coming on today. Are there any last words of hope that you would like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I think, one of the reason I love doing this work is because I do think there is so much hope. I think that we know that the brain is always able to change and learn. I'm learning more every day, in part due to your podcast about recovery after brain injury and the supports that are out there. And yeah, I think just continue to set goals for yourself that are attainable, and you'll see yourself keep moving forward, and just look into all the different resources that are out there and advocate for yourself.
Thank you so much. I really
Thank you
appreciate
so much for
it.
having me.
Yes, so glad to have you on. And if people want to get in touch with you, can you share your website or Instagram?
Yeah, my website is lotusslp.com, and we're active on Instagram. The handle is at lotus_SLP. We also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account. And my contact info, if you wanted to email me, is also on our website. I'd be happy to chat with anyone.
Thank you so much. I know that means a lot to our listeners. So, all right. Thanks so much. And definitely, I recommend get in touch with Katherine if you have questions about speech language pathology, or if you're in Maine, that's where you practice, right? So if you have a listener up there and you'd like to connect with her, definitely reach out.
Thank you so much, Christabel.
Thank you.